Okay, so we're going to, we talked a lot about the structural frame, and then we went in to talk about human resources, where human resources are easier to understand because it's at the individual and also group level in which we function. I think we're going back up to the organization level in terms of more conceptual. So by understanding the structure and understanding the human dynamics that we talked about in the last couple of chapters, we'll understand a little bit more about the politics. And so you answered my questions. I'm going to give you a flash of the 4 frames just because you're going to be using that for your group project as well as your individual projects. And then we're going to talk about the political framework, which is chapter 9. I believe it's 9 and 10, or it could be, I have to double check. And then the small groups you already did at the beginning of this lecture. So the 4 frames, like I said, you're going to dream about it in your sleep. Once again, structural, human resources, we were able to cover that. And then we're going to move into political and symbolic. We're going to spend a little bit more time in the politics and the symbol of it, and then go back to the human resources, because in your book, it starts talking about leadership. You'll notice with the current events and use of technology, the news media, etc., sometimes leaders are born due to circumstances, as well as leaders are present when the circumstances come about. So there's a lot of different ways to lead, and unfortunately or fortunately, politics usually get a bad rep. However, politics is something that you cannot avoid ever if you want to work in an organization or with humans. So let me talk about politics. So going back to politics, this is the definition that all of us are have seen in the past. I'm going to just move myself so you can see. And you notice that the politics is rooted in poli-sci. And if you haven't studied poli-sci or political science, you've seen it every year, whether in the state, local level, and also on the national level of the politicians running for different positions. Also in organizations, you are also seeing interest, conflict, power, usually scarce resources. A lot of folks, we are limited by resources. Therefore, we're competing for the resources. So a lot of the wars and conflicts and things, at the end of the day, you'll see some of that power, resources, conflict, interest, etc. The central focus is getting and using power. So you'll notice that different countries, different organizations have different leverage or different powers. And of course, they're standing in the political frame. Managing the conflict to get things done is going to be key. I know a lot of times people want to avoid conflict just because it's really uncomfortable, but we have to accept the fact that what one of your classmates mentioned, that fundamentally, even if we have the same kind of genes per se, we are all different depending on what kind of experience, what kind of upbringing, and various different, your jobs, etc., is going to dictate your experiences. The power, conflict, and coalition. So these are going to be important because in order for you to have power, you have to have, you need to be leading, right? And then there's also, in order to have a coalition, you need people that is following you as a leader or the organization. The assumptions of the political frame, we talk about how if you have power, you have more decision powers usually. The authorities and partisans, There's also sources of power. So in organization, powers, we notice in Google and Facebook, some of the Silicon Valley, I know if you're coming from old school, it makes you really uncomfortable because you don't really know who is leading what, right? It doesn't really have a clear hierarchy of where the sources of powers are. Distribution of power. So we're going to talk about different types of powers in terms of overbounded and underbounded systems. There's conflicts in organization, as well as a lot of times what gets in the news is the moral mazes, people who actually cut the corners and actually decide to get ahead without thinking about the ethics, or they just decide the rules don't apply for them. So let me move this. So in order for you to have power, you need to have organization that come together as a coalition. So I think some of you have mentioned that in order to create a school, for instance, you have to have people interested in the same goal and mission. You also need power in order to make decision. Not everyone can lead. So going back to probably the kitchen analogy is that not everyone needs to be the chef. Some folks have to do other things. They have to be the sous chef and then all the assistant in order for things to get done. Because as we saw in our definition of what the culture would look like in the next 100 years, even with a small group of us, we had different variations of what the 100 years would look like. And also our perspective in terms of, is it going to be optimistic, pessimistic, somewhere in the middle? So even with a small group of people, you have varying views. But it's also good to have some kind of structure in which we know that decisions will be made. Don't you hate being in meetings where everyone is so polite that no one is making a decision? You're sitting around for about an hour. Someone has to make the decision. And sometimes that person gets, especially if you're a woman, you usually get some labels that are not really nice. But in order for things to get done, decisions have to be made. Authorities and partisans, sources of power, we're going to talk about the distribution of power depending on organizations, and conflicts. If there's no conflict in organization, it's probably not it's not running smoothly. You have to have some kind of conflicts that are resolved in the setting. And moral mazes, as you know, like I said, you'll notice them on television, and it doesn't happen overnight. Usually it happens little by little. And then all of a sudden that little by little becomes like a big, big bad decision. So in terms of the organization, a lot of the organization that have a lot of, and of course, this is stereotyping because we know that the Amazon has a structure that is more hierarchical or traditional than, let's say, Google. A lot of times when workers do not have a voice, so more of a pyramid structure, sometimes there's discontent because not everyone is represented. Therefore, the coalition, having a group of people as a organization that is diverse, and that's one of the reasons why there's a huge movement of diversity, equity, inclusion, and orientation. I think there's another, accessibility is another one that they have added on. When I talked to one of the publishing companies, is the fact that not only are we talking about those three, but also accessibility, meaning who has access to the data, because knowledge is power, and education. Hopefully we are, with the technology, we're able to educate as many people as we can. But for a long time, it was a select few of people who actually had all the knowledge. Organization goals are multiple and sometimes conflicting. So of course, you cannot have multiple goals that pleases everyone. You need to have goals that are not so, you should have a mission and vision that are very singular, but in terms of the goals, they should be diverse, meaning that you should have multiple goals that meet some of the requirements of your coalition members or your workers. They should reflect some of the bargaining that involve with multiple players on divergent interests. So, for example, we were talking about flying cars. I think some of you are like, no, some of us are like, yes. And where is that middle ground of maybe all of us will have rockets? I don't know, but it needs to have a reflecting bargaining effort in terms of being able to have goals that reflect some of the, futuristic or futurist goals that which is used in a lot of the organization, where people ask like, what kind of leader are you? And of course we don't have a crystal ball, but a lot of times the term that's used here in Northern California, for instance, is, are you able to look to the future and embrace it? Not necessarily look to 100 years from now, but be able to see how things that are changing are able to be incorporated into your organization, even if you're not in the tech industry. So another thing, sorry, the green part is not showing up as well. So Gamson is, in your book, talks about authorities and partisans. What are the difference between the authorities and partisans? So authorities are making binding decisions. A lot of times they are doing, they're on the board, or they are a group of people who are able to make regulations, policies, etc. They're agents of social control. So they're able to change behavior of folks in your group. They seek to maintain authority, so you know who they are. And also it depends on, their position really depends on how influential they are. So, so for example, the modern example is, although the authorities, usually government CEOs or people in the C-suites, will have these authorities, but in tech world and social media, the authorities are now what you call social influencers, who actually have millions of people following them, who are following, they're not necessarily experts, right? However, they are able to make people do certain things, or understand or listen to misinformation, right information, etc. So I know some of my colleagues who are in government, also in public health, we were very surprised to hear that the Biden administration, which was a right move to get the social media influencers such as TikTok, Instagram, and some of the other social media platforms, they invited them to the briefing for the Ukraine crisis to give them the information that they're getting, to send it off to the social media so they have the right information to send to the public. So, in terms of agents of social control, I think the definition is going to definitely change due to the changes in politics and also technology and COVID-19. Everything has turned upside down, unfortunately, or I'm crossing my fingers, but there's a surge, another surge of COVID variant that is seen in Europe right now. So it's moving up. It's another variant of Omicron. And we're watching it just to see if it's going to be as deadly and also else have more infections. And we're going back to some of the measures. In terms of, so the difference between authorities and partisans are dependent on the authority's decision. So usually they're the employees or people at the lower rank who is at the whim of some of the folks who are making the decisions. So they could be the workers, the authorities, or managers, lower managers, higher managers, or in the executive suite making the decisions. So the partisans will support and may actually question the authority depending on how it affects their work. So in our organization, usually if it's going to affect your job security, for instance, I know one of you is looking at the governance of universities. So this also depends on the whole power and decision making. Where on the in the role are you in terms of making? Are you making the decisions, or are you following the decisions? And if you question it, do you have the security to actually question the decisions? Of course, in the government, they have the whistleblowing regulations and etc. to protect folks. However, still, there's a lot of politics involved. This diagram is a little bit too small, but basically I was trying to get all those components in, which is the position of power, control of rewards. So how do you control power? Who has the power? Usually people have funding, or they have resources, they have rewards, meaning usually monetary value, but it could be something else. They also have coercive power, where they may have like military forces, or they may have resources that you cannot get from anywhere else. Information and expertise is another way of sources of power, which right now is actually being actually disseminated, because now, like 15 years ago, before Google, if you were to ask someone about epidemiology, for instance, most of the folks thought that I was a skin doctor. I would probably have better skin, but you wouldn't be able to Google it. I have to tell you what it is, right? You have to go figure it out by going to the library, etc. Now with the internet, by me saying one term, you're able to put it in the internet and get the information. Or any study that I talk about, you could go to the UIW library and find it as I'm talking to you via Zoom. So information and expertise right now, it's somewhere, but it's still position of power. More knowledge that you have, more power that you have. Reputation. That's one of the things that we're going to talk about when you go into symbolism. The next framing is the branding aspect of it. So Toyota, for instance, has a certain reputation. Mercedes, with the Germany, for instance, going to the Mercedes factory and looking at how cars are made and how sturdy they are, they have certain reputations that you don't even have to explain. Personal power. People just command the room. When they walk in, there are certain people who are able to, you can just feel their sheer presence. You know, they don't have to be 6 feet tall and whatever, 250, 300 pounds. It just, you could be, 5'1" and still command the room. You just have that personal power and personal presence. This comes with experience and also your alliances and network. This was really, especially in New York, I'm sure it exists in San Antonio. I was never part of it, so I don't know. And I know that in San Francisco and California area, it is so true. It's who you know, who you network, and and even in the military, for instance, like as you go up the ranks, depending on which area you're in, you have people that are vouching for you, saying, you know, she or he is really good at this job. I think we should put him or her up for promotion, or etc. So alliances and network, people who are able to have wide network and strong alliances usually have a lot of power. Also, access and control of the agenda. So you are able to change and control the agenda that you set for the meeting, and also for the not only the meeting, but organization, as well as the whole image. There's that politics of access and control, who's able to change that, and also framing of control, meaning the perception of control is also going to be really important. So the politics, I know this sounds really crazy when I wish I actually have taken, when I was younger, acting classes, communication classes, and some of these things that people take for granted, because I know there's a lot of great leaders who are able to articulate and be able to convey their message clearly. And that comes with practice and time and knowing your audience and having control over your agenda as well as your topic. So let me talk about some of the sources of power. Just because you have power doesn't mean that you have good power. So there are two types of powers that you'll see: overbounded and underbounded. So these are just technical terms that are used in systems and organization, where overbounded are the extreme end, where you have strong top-down control. Conflict is tightly regulated, so meaning it seems like there's no conflict, but there is. People are kind of afraid to talk about it. In your textbook, it refers to Iraq under Saddam Hussein as an overbounded system, as an extreme case of what power looks like. The underbounded is weak authority, chaotic decision made by having open conflict, etc., and power struggles. Usually, another example is having like a puppet regime, where the regime itself doesn't have any power. Someone else is actually controlling it, but it's just underbound. And so when the Iraq, after the invasion, there was a collapse of the old regime, which was had strong power, and what came in was more underbound, which is described in your textbook. Another thing that you are going to see is, we talked about this conflict. Conflict is natural and inevitable. And of course, I know for me, when I was growing up, my mom always told me, you know, don't disagree, be, you know, be kind, don't argue, etc. But in organization, we can have either too much or too little of it. If you're always fighting about same things, people get really tired. But if there's no conflict, it just means that it's everyone is saying that they're just going along with the majority, or they do not want to rock the boat. The political frame focuses on strategy, meaning we want to see how the overall strategy for your structural framing fits with the political frame, and then the tactics that they're using in order to deal with the conflict. So when you have that pyramid scheme or hierarchical scheme, usually it's understood like silence is golden, let's not rock the boat. However, like I said, a lot of the cases, that's usually not the best strategy. You need to be addressing the conflicts that are in the organization. So what kind of conflicts do you see in organization? There are three different kinds. So hierarchical conflict. So in an organization could be small organization to a large organization, where you have a conflict with the CEO, and then also people who are underneath it. A lot of times people hire CEOs from the outside, and then they work to make things better. However, so the example that I can give you is, for example, in a lot of the medical or public health organizations, when you see some of the CEOs of the hospitals, etc., it's pretty rare that the CEOs are actually MDs or DOs or actual doctors. They are not necessarily, they're more of an administrator. So when they institute some of the things on the ground for doing charting or electronic medical records, etc., it looks great on paper. It looks great in terms of profit and losses, and it looks great in terms of the whole administrative end. However, at the end of the day, when the physicians or people who are seeing the patient, it's not working. So you have the hierarchical conflict where you're working for a hospital and you may or may not have a say depending on where you are. And of course, it's with other Amazon, for example, if you're working at a factory, for instance, how much say do you have in terms of what the CEO is going to say? There's also horizontal conflict in organizations. So the example that we can talk about is actually like flying cars. All of us have varying views about what flying cars would look like, and the conflict within the same level, lateral level, also is an issue. There's also cultural issues, not necessarily, let's say, ethnicity or your background, but you may be hired as a newbie coming from a different culture. So let's say you came from a for-profit industry going into nonprofit industry. Most of the things are very similar. However, the whole mentality of what for-profit and nonprofit is different. So you're going in from one culture to another, and try to cope with it, in terms of internally, externally, etc. So the conflict is natural and it's inevitable. We don't necessarily do a great job, especially in education. I have to say that we as teachers do such a great job of teaching our students, but sometimes internally when we talk among ourselves or with some of the administrators, that conflict exists because it's difficult sometimes to have these candid discussions without the safety net, for example. And one of the things that we talk about is the moral mazes. You often see people I know Martha Stewart went to prison, right? And a couple of other notable folks went to prison for doing insider trading and some of the things where, how did they get there, for example? It's because the politics of getting ahead. I know when you are very competitive, you tend to hide things or not share things with others. Information is power. And so sometimes you kind of don't think about the collective, you think about yourself in terms of the scarce resources. You're looking at your individual performance as opposed to the larger organization. In United States, individual achievement is highly regarded, which is great, but I think it's also really important to see where you fit in the organization. There should be some balance. I could say this for the Asian countries, the collective is very important, and sometimes the individual success is lost. So there needs to be some kind of balance. There's no good or bad in knowing the assessment of where you are individually and the group, but I think that should be addressed. The organization cannot eliminate politics. I know I also sit around and I'm like, oh, politics, why? Every organization that I worked at, thank goodness for being a military spouse. Like I said, this is my 13th university, and politics, all the same. And any organization, whether I worked in a hospital, community-based settings, clinics, you name schools, you name it, there's always politics. There's going to be conflicts. There's different ways of speaking, talking about various different things. And I think we have to always ask ourselves, does the advancement depend on good work or doing what is politically correct. So you have to, when you go into the organization, I think one of the things I always kind of look at is, are people happy for others who are doing good work and they're able to share their, successes. So for example, if you're going for the same job, for instance, would everyone actually mention that there's an opportunity, because if you are working as a team, everyone has an equal chance of kind of competing for the same position. So it's sometimes that one way of like, are you doing it for politically correct reasons? So for example, I know some of my friends who are in the military, they tell me, oh, she always does things for the general, but when it comes to the captain, she doesn't do anything, So, which is not, it should be the same all across, but at the same time, I know it's really, really difficult. Like there's that individual success versus the organization success. And I know I struggle with it just because I have unrealistic expectations of what success means to me, as opposed to what success means to other people. And organizations can influence the kind of politics that they have by the culture that they create, which is really difficult to do. So getting to the conclusion, meaning for this chapter that you were able to read, hopefully during spring break or now during the week, that the traditional view is the organizations are formed. The traditional view is like a CEO or the president on the top, and they're making all the decisions. And then the political view is when you have coalition of people who actually have some input. So when you have a traditional and a political view that is married together with the right balance, hopefully it's not nasty and really awful, because you've seen politics at its worst, as we mentioned, especially with masking, vaccine, etc. during COVID, where you've seen so many people on one side to the other. But the constructive politics is really possible and necessary for organization to be effective. You have to advocate and also empower your people to do the things that you want them to do. In order to do that, you have to form a group or a coalition. This could only be done at a higher level in terms of not just structurally, but also on a political level, where being with the power or people who have power think this way, and it's rewarded, when you do things that are kinder, more compassionate, etc., as opposed to a person who is at the top due to their individual accomplishments. So let me look. I'm going to stop, pause, resume. So the next chapter is going to be about managers as politicians. And like I said, people don't like to think of themselves as politicians, but learning to be a good politician is going to be key. Skills of a manager as a politician, what am I talking about? So if you had a lot of different jobs, or you moved up in your own organization or different organization, it's key to understand different politics that exist in the organization. Also, the ethics and politics, you also have to go in and understand what the politics are, what the ethics of your personal ethics, as well as your industry ethics, the professional ethics that you ethics and standards that you abide by in your profession is going to be very important. So many of you are teachers, for instance. There are ethics and standards that you have to meet. Me as teacher and also public health, we have ethics and standards that we have to abide by to ensure that we are not crossing the line. So, why do we talk about managers as politicians? And like I said, I wish I knew this when I was younger, just because I always thought politicians were like slick. They don't know, they just want to get elected. However, it's politics. I think a few people that are on television put politics in a bad light. It's politicians, what they do is they are able to set an agenda and be able to have your people follow you and see you as an authority. You have a vision and objective, a strategy for achieving the vision. So not only are you giving a vision, but you're also giving a roadmap. So we can see great presidents, great leaders, great folks who are leading different efforts. Their visions and their objectives are very clear. Their strategies on getting there is very clear too. It's like you're going to take step one and step two. Mapping the political terrain is really important, because if you end up getting people who are making the decisions at the top really angry, you're not going to move that agenda. You have to determine channel of informal communication. I know this sounds like an old school or all boys club kind of thing, but it exists. So, for example, even in the technical age, you have to understand when to send emails, when to pick up the phone, when to Zoom to talk about various different things, and using asynchronous such as Slack channels. And in our Canvas, for example, there's emails, there's FAQs that you can post, but you have to know what kind of channels of communication that you can use to understand and know people on the other end. You need to identify the principal agents of political influence. So, who has the power? Who is leading the charge in an organization? We're not all going to vote for a manager. Usually, managers are hired by the upper executives or upper management. And also, you need to anticipate the counter strategy. So, if people don't follow your agenda or your roadmap, do you have options? How far are you willing to bargain to get to this end result without veering off to no man's land? And I think for me, because I'm an epidemiologist or public health official, I'm always thinking the worst case scenario, and which is not always great. However, it gives me a plan of action in terms of, okay, if the worst case scenario happens, how am I going to survive, kind of thing. And it allows you to kind of know what your like what your limits are, and be able to kind of map out some of the steps. Of course, you can't see the future, but a lot of folks go in without knowing all the term, like who needs to be notified, who needs to do A, B, and C. Uh, Drawing the political map. And of course, people always talk about, okay, this only applies to government. Indeed, it does involve the government, especially if your boss is appointed by, let's say, your mayor or a governor. It is very political, depending on if it's all, Republican or Democrat Congress, for example. Their vision and their view of what they're going to accomplish that year is going to be different. But for organizations, similar, depending on which state you live in, where you are, the I was going to say chemical makeup, but the the composition of the people that you're working with is going to frame the central issue, meaning the key choice that people disagree about. So you need to know in your own group, and I know some of you mentioned that you're working with a new group of people. The more you know them, you know their trigger points and what's going to set them off, what they're willing to kind of give up to kind of get to certain places. And you need to identify the key players who's likely to influence the outcome. I know this sounds like you're playing mind games, but It's not necessarily. I think you have to shift your thinking. I know when I was talking to some of the fundraisers, for example, sometimes you feel like, oh my gosh, I'm begging for money. You know, I feel like a professional beggar to get things done. However, it's the shift in thinking where you're asking folks to invest in your vision, in your school, or in your endeavor to serve others. And when you make that switch and know the key players, they'll be on board to understand how to go about doing that. How much power does each player have to the extent where they can push on getting the agenda across. So, depending on how important the issue is, a lot of times you have to know who you're presenting to, what you're going to be doing, and how much power that is going to be utilized in order to push the agenda. So, if you go into your textbook, you have this diagram, which is really, they do, Bowman and Deal actually have really great diagrams where political maps seen as techies and strong support and weak support for opposition of change. We know that a lot of times you have the y-axis with power and the interest. So the the interest, for example, opposed to change, you can see tech folks who are high up in the top management and techies have a lot of power and they're open to change. Middle managers and frontline officials, on the other hand, they have some power, not ultimate power. And then they're somewhere in the middle range of opposed to change or not, or very opposed to change because the reality is bounded by the power that they have and also how much change that they can actually make. Because you've probably been in situations where you want to make a lot of change, but you had no power. There's nothing you can do. You have to kind of tap into the key players to make the changes. Another real political map, the battleground with the strong players on both sides, for example, are usually very high. The middle managers and frontline officials, they already have a mechanism in place. They're working with the people on the ground and they have a system in place. When you change, all those systems that are in place have to change. Therefore, there's usually that conflict or tension in where usually if the top management have never worked in any of the roles, there's more of the schism that you'll see in these power struggles and conflicts. So strong players on both sides, and then you'll see the power and interest and how some people are able to kind of transcend the power and interest through really great speeches and also movement of people telling them what is really important. This happens with building networking and building coalitions. When you have strong relationships, so let's say if you're a middle manager, but you're able to bring in like $1 million from Bill Gates Foundation just because your idea was fabulous, it puts you up the power and also the ability to change. So you need to identify relevant relationships. I think one of your classmates was talking about how not only identifying the relationship, you have to foster the relationship. It's not a one-time thing. It has to be a rapport, a relationship. They see the vision with you and traveling through the journey together. You also have to identify who the naysayers are, who's going to resist this change, right? So, and you also have to develop a relationship with potential opponents. So you probably have heard keep your enemies close. Definitely. They're not really enemies per se, competitors, but there may be always a naysayer where that's not going to happen. I don't know why you're talking about that, right? So there's ways to, there's a lot of time and investment that needs to be done in order for you to to have network and building coalitions to build your own power. You need to persuade first, and then use forceful method. I think sometimes the old managers say to the old-fashioned way, like, okay, why are we doing this? Because I said so, I'm your boss. That doesn't work anymore. You need to kind of persuade why you're doing certain things and how it's tied into the strategies, your mission and vision, in order for people to work for you and also build coalitions and then broaden your network. And I think that's one of the reasons why some of the organizations that you mentioned in for your personal project works, because of the fact that people have input in the organization and they feel passionate about it. So one of the organization with arts, for example, they have young people coming in, producing, showing their stuff, and be able to be part of the community and grow. Also, like I said, we talked about the bargaining and negotiation. And one of I know those of you, if you're in organizations or if you have your own business, or you're in a position where you're managing, have a business plan, you have all the budget that you have to take care of, etc. Creating value is going to be really important. I know for us, for public health, I can speak to my profession, is you build it, they'll come kind of thing. Like, they need us because you need clean water, clean this, but not necessarily, it is true, clean water, clean air, everything, but you have to kind of create, why are you joining this association or this school or this university? Like, why are you here? And one of the things that you have to understand is, politics wise, value creating, like the value proposition that you hear about in business. You need to separate people from the problem. You need to focus on the interest. What is a common interest? And then inventing options for a mutual gain. So how many people can win-win in the invention or the thing that you're doing? And then also having an objective criteria, meaning just because you know certain people, you get ahead, which causes a lot of resentment in an organization. You probably heard of people saying they love the organization, but they hated the manager, so they leave. So the ethics is going to be really important, but the value proposition, what are you creating? Like, why are people buying Marvel comics or Toyota cars as opposed to some other cars? Like, you need to figure out what makes you so different and create that value for people to come to you for education or come to your organization and work for you. Or stay on for years, for example. I know for the military, for instance, people have options. They could get out, but I know when people are very service driven and they have a mission, they stay on for 20 years because they want to serve. They believe in that freedom. They believe that, that it is something that they need to do. So it's important to focus on those criteria and figure out how to solve that political conflict that you may see with some of the folks in your organization. One of the value claiming strategies that you see in your book, you'll notice that bargaining is a mixed motive game. Not everyone's going to be happy. There's going to be a few people who are going to just hate you at the end because you cut them out of whatever they wanted. There's no way, there's incentives, but you cannot really please everyone, as all of you know. Like, I think one of your classmates mentioned spring break. One kid is going to New York City, the other two is going to SeaWorld, etc. It just, it's hard to kind of meet all the expectations of everyone. So bargaining is important, but to a certain point. process of interdependent decisions. I think unilateral decisions where this is a law, this is what you have to do, like what a king would do, or what um, a leader who doesn't want any kind of input from their people will do. Dictators, for example. It's so important to get interdependent decisions. Control of uncertainty gives power. So in terms of, we saw this during COVID pandemic, there was so much uncertainty. People who actually gained a lot of power are the folks who were able to harness that uncertainty. Kind of people either give hope or fear, somewhere in that spectrum. Emphasizing threats as opposed to sanctions. So, of course, you have to talk about the consequences. I know, as those of you who are parents, for example, you have to punish your kids because they have to know that there are consequences. So if there are no actions to what you say, they're not going to follow. So yes, indeed, talk about consequences, but also talk about what will happen. And we talked about the threats, and then calculate the optimal level of threat. So I know one of your classmates mentioned plan for the worst, hope for the best. So somewhere in the middle, how much is too much threat or how much is too little threat? So in business world, I believe it translates into risk. Are you are you able to endure a lot of risk, or you're not so much? You have to know yourself, know thyself, in order for you to definitely lead. And some of the things that you have to also look at is mutual understanding, as well as, are all parties under the same understanding of rules? So if you have set of rules in your organization where it talks about how people get promoted, how people get punished, or how people go on leave, etc., they need to be followed. Generality, meaning what specific actions follow. I guess general rules, meaning what is something that is like a total no, like if you do it, it's a no. Like for example, like if you're stealing from company funds, so using your business card for your personal trip, for instance, it's like stealing from your company. How is that treated? And then openness. Are you willing to make a decision to the public? Are you transparent? A lot of times decisions are made, but you don't know why the decisions are made. Like, for example, if one of your colleagues were let go, no one knows what happened. Not that you have to kind of talk about personal issues, but somehow communicate what's going on. And I think all of you mentioned this today during your the 100 years, what will happen in the culture is the caring nature. We need to be human centric. As we move into more technology, we're moving so far away from being human, for example. I know kids, I see it in kids because I know when I was younger, you have to go in front of another kid's face and say these insults to them, not just write them in these, the computer post where you don't see any reaction, and it's hard to see the consequences, and we're moving a little bit further away from the human nature. Like what makes us human is the caring nature. That does the action show care for others, and is it showing interest of that other person, which we sometimes lose, especially successful companies. They start really small, they had really good intention of being caring, and then they really grow and they forget that human nature aspect of it. And then lastly, the conclusion in terms of the politicians, politics could be really destructive, as you saw with the Capitol rating last year, and with masks, with vaccines, etc. It could be a very destructive and also disappointing vehicle if it's not used correctly. However, it could be so wonderful, achieving noble purposes. Think about Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. These are all social programs that came about through someone with noble purpose. How do you have some kind of system to help people who are in need? Of course, it doesn't help everyone because we talked about how sometimes lower middle class doesn't qualify for some of these Medicaid stuff because they're just right above that cutoff line. The managers need to develop skills of a constructive politicians. They need to be able to communicate. They need to know the agenda. They need to network and build coalitions where the people who are following you know that what they say will move up to the chain to people who are making a decision, or they're able to make that limited decision. Negotiating. In life, you're always negotiating, right? So while you're sitting in this class, you could be doing something else. So you're making a choice to be at a certain place. So being able to negotiate, knowing the people that you serve and also you lead is going to be very important in surviving the politics of the organization. So I'm going to stop here. I talked